So how do I follow that? Well, we're going to stay with the theme of storytelling. It's something that if you were with us earlier in the week on Monday, you'll know we spoke about storytelling with Jeffrey Archer. But I want to now look at the trend of modern retellings and revivals, particularly in film, but also in literature too. I want to also ask if reinvention is still the commercial success that it once was. So to do that, please welcome my next panel, the author, Amish Tripathi, Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and also the poet, writer and communications specialist, Prasoon Joshi. Come on up, please. Nice to see you all. Take a seat. Nice to see you all. I feel like we've met every day this week so far, so lovely to see you. But we've made it to Thursday. And we can have
except for Prasoon, who just came after having won at Cannes. So, round of applause for it.
And I will talk about that in a moment as well. Amish, let's start with that topic, because there is maybe a trend right now of reinventing stories. It's about sequels. It's about kind of retelling the same story in a different way. In your writing, you've done that. You revisit established narratives. What is it about going back to the same stories, but telling them in a slightly different way that has such appeal?
I think that emerges from cultures which are very attached to their roots. And look, if you remain stuck and rigid to what the original stories were, often they end up dying out. Why is it that the modern Greeks don't worship Apollo and Zeus anymore? Why don't the modern Egyptians worship Amun-Ra anymore? Whereas Indians continue to worship our ancient gods. We still chant hymns that were composed 8,000 years ago. Everyone, for example, I chant the Shri Rudra. That was composed 8,000 years ago. We are the only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still alive. I think one of the reasons for that is India has had a tradition of keeping the best of the old and adding in something of the new every few centuries. What that does is it just infuses new life into those old stories. We retain our connection to our ancient roots. But make it relevant to a modern time once again. And if those stories are not reinvented, then they die out, like sadly happened with the pagan Greeks or with the pharaonic Egyptians. Indians have this ability. So actually it's been an ancient tradition. Our stories keep getting reinvented.
And Sanjeev, is this about sort of breathing new life into the same story, or is it revisiting the same stories told from a different perspective?
I mean, clearly the point that Amish is making, that you need to infuse new light and life and new relevance to old stories. But sometimes the stories need to be retold in a completely different way. So let me tell you about my own sort of way of doing it. For example, the way India's history is told in India is told from a uniquely landlocked way. Whereas in fact our history is mostly maritime. India is the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after it, the Indian Ocean. And yet, our history books tend to be all about stuff inland. So one of my books called The Ocean of Churn is about the history of the Indian Ocean, where of course the Indians were sailing up and down and across it for thousands of years. And it's a very exciting story. I don't know if you're aware, but I'm actually building an ancient ship using ancient techniques, no nails used in it. So a ship which we will then sail to Oman and then out to Bali in Indonesia. So it's not just about retelling the story as in literature. The fun thing is actually to build these ships. So that ship is under construction in Goa and should be in water next year.
And tell me, that's a project about revisiting historical roots, but also is that a project that you will write about? That will be a story in itself?
Yes, so I've already written a book called Ocean of Churn, which is the history. So now this will probably be more visual. So we'll probably do it more like a National Geographic kind of adventure video. So it's already, the construction of ship is being documented. And of course, the voyage itself will be documented. So the Sultan of Oman and the Indian Prime Minister have already announced that in 2025, we will do this voyage to Muscat from India. And so yes, so we'll do it in that way, and I'm sure the technical details of it will be written as academic papers. And so, yes, so that kind of thing is something I like doing.
When it keeps those stories alive. And
Keeps the story alive.
And I want to come on to, in just a second, turning literature as well into television as well, because I know that's something you're involved in too. Prasoon, nice to see you as well. Welcome. Tell me about Cannes, though. Congratulations. And the importance of something like Cannes to not only, recognise and acknowledge these stories, but also the ability to reward them and open them up to a whole new audience.
Yeah, of course. I'll come to Cannes, but taking the point forward, the interpretation when it comes to of the stories which already exist. I mean, I have worked in both kinds of films. I mean, a film like Manikarnika, which will be very historical in nature, or something which is a Tare Zameen Par, which will be a story which is told in today's times. I think the modern storytelling, when it borrows from a collective culture, where there is a culture of collective storytelling, there is a less of ego there. In modern writing or modern creation, the self, the concept of self, who created it, who wrote it, who is the storyteller, becomes very important. And that's where the caution has to be exercised. Because when you're borrowing from the collective, you can have a vantage point. And it could be absolutely a different vantage point. I mean, the river is flowing and the one who is fighting with the waves would describe the river as aggressive. And the one who is meditating at the river bank will describe the river as calm. So vantage point definitely can change. But the sense of ego, when it comes in the modern writing, that's where you are seeking too much of originality at times. When you're seeking too much of originality, you want your own stamp to be put. This is my take. In that, I'm not saying it's not allowed. Condescension should not be there. That my word is the last word. Then you have to respect. Mine is one of the interpretations. Absolutely. There could be many other. Hence, the truth would be there. It's there, staring at you. Yeah. And you have your own way of looking at it. So in the modern writing, we have to be careful because a lot of sitting on the certification board also. My fellow member is here, Vani. And I feel that we often see that people take objections to something which is historical.
Because it doesn't align with their perspective.
India has, faced a lot of challenges in that. If you see what is mythological and what is historical, a lot of debate about that. Is oral tradition something which can be dismissed as oral tradition and not something which is historical? So a lot of these challenges are there. Yeah. So one, you are borrowing from existing stories and telling them in today's context. I think we have to be, we have to do in-depth work before you can sort of venture into it.
Yeah, and Sanjeev, that point about perspective is so important. That's what you did with Revolutionaries, wasn't it? You told a familiar story, but from a different perspective. And that breathes a whole new life into what might be a familiar story. Just tell me about that.
Yes, so this familiar story, this is what he's talking about, relates to my book called The Revolutionaries, which is a history of India's freedom struggle from the perspective of the armed resistance to British occupation. So the way the story is usually told is that the Gandhi sort of gently suggested to the British to leave and they politely left. But there is another story which is much more violent and involves assassinations and shootouts and all kinds of things, incidentally involving many members of my family. And I thought that story is also an interesting story, and they have a completely different view of how India became independent. So, and so that story too needed to be told. There's lots of evidence for it since it's only 100 years old, all these events. So I wrote this down. The book has been, of course, a runaway bestseller, but we are now converting it into a Amazon Prime 2-season OTT series. Nikhil Advani is going to direct and produce it. And it's full of action, as you can imagine. There's spies and plots and assassinations and stuff like that. But again, you have to be true to this. And this is the point that Prasoon was saying. Since I'm kind of helping put the script together, very often the script writers feel that they need to add masala to this whole thing. And I keep telling them, the actual events are so crazy, you don't need to. Because every time they need something to sort of create a bridge or something, I actually tell them, there is another event that actually happened, and let me tell you about it, and let's use this. So, of course, we won't have it exactly in the way things happened, but more or less by adjusting real events around a little bit, we managed to keep the chain of the story going, because it's 16 parts, so we have to create the links through them.
And how do you interpret that then for a global audience? For a story like that, what is different about you writing the book and then translating that onto the television?
So it is a global audience in the sense, obviously there's a language issue, but other than that, now it's quite common to use some sort of subtext kind of thing. Yeah. But the thing is, these events that happened in India weren't sort of happening only in India. They were directly linked to things that were happening in the rest of the world. So, for example, the first season will be a lot about the Gadar movement, which happened coincidentally with the First World War. Many of the allies of the revolutionaries were people like the IRA. In fact, they called themselves the Hindustan Republican Army, directly named to sound like the Irish Republican Army. So there is a lot of this global stuff happening, and of course, it culminates, as many of you know, in the Indian National Army in Singapore during the Second World War with Netaji and so on. So all of these things are global events just as much as they're Indian events.
Yeah. And Amish, we talked about this earlier in the week, didn't we? About that disconnect between what people in India are reading and watching, and what the rest of the world thinks India is interested in. Are you confident that gap is closing? That there's now an understanding of how India is represented on a world stage in art, literature, and film, but also those stories of India now have a growing relevance around the world, because they are stories. They happen to be based in India, but they are stories of humanity. They're stories of survival. They're stories of war. These are common themes. They're not unique to India or exclusive.
A few things. One, it hasn't changed yet, but it will, because till now it was more a sermon from the West to India. Yeah. Now it's a conversation, because the Indians are also speaking. And if you think about it, it's kind of a surprise that practically every country in the world has a rectangular flag. Every country in the world magically has a national anthem that fits somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Now, these are all Western paradigms which is just cascaded down. All of us blindly follow it. Yeah. Traditional Indian flags were not rectangular. They were actually triangular. Yeah. That's how, and most Indians have actually forgotten it. The Nepalis, I don't know if there are any Nepalis here, the Nepalis are much more deeply rooted than we Indians are. Their flag continues to be triangular, right? So till now, whatever would be the Western paradigm would just get absorbed into India. There's a reason why India has glass wall buildings. I mean, just a separate... In Western Europe, it makes sense. There's a shortage of the sun. In India, it makes absolutely no sense. There's an excess of the sun. We're building giant microwave ovens, basically, right? Why? Because all of us want to be Westernized. Now, after many centuries, India is speaking again. So it'll actually, instead of a sermon, it'll become a conversation. Now, will there be some dissonance in this? Yes, there may be some Westerners who may not like it because they think, oh, Indians are talking back. Are you becoming extremists? No, we're just speaking our point of view. There's another angle as well, to the point that Prasoon was thinking. Many of the Indians, because the Indian Indians have felt that our culture has been disrespected. At times, there's a sense of insecurity. Right. And my suggestion to my fellow Indians is let that go. That was in the past, right? If you see racism when there is no racism, if you see condescension where there is no condescension, you actually spoil the conversation. Then it becomes an argument, right? We must speak our point of view confidently. It will change. It's a matter of time. As India becomes more and more economically powerful, we'll naturally become more culturally powerful. I don't know how many of you have heard of Chanakya. Chanakya had said wonderfully, Sukhasya moolam dharma, dharmasya moolam artha. At the heart of, and I'll translate, don't worry. At the heart of, happiness and peace is dharma. At the heart of dharma is artha, which is wealth and power. Chanakya had said very clearly, wealth and power is at the heart of everything. If you don't have that, your culture means nothing. No one's going to listen to you. As India becomes wealthier and more powerful, it will change. And it will change with the West as well, it will change with the rest of the world.
And Prasoon, I'm interested in that, India's so ripe for such amazing historical stories, and yet how do you stop modern retellings of them just being a bit of nostalgia, just to kind of, retelling the same story? How do you reinterpret it for a new audience? And how do you bring that to a wider audience? Because technology allows you to take these stories to more places than ever before, much more quickly.
I think first thing is that I like the democratization of storytelling today. Now you were told stories, now you are telling stories.
Yep.
So when you were told stories, you were told the stories which were considered right for you. Now you are telling stories which you think you want to tell.
Right.
In fact, India is so much so, I also do, communication advertising. And the challenge we face today is there are more storytellers than listeners.
Right.
So the fact, so everybody has a story to tell.
Yeah. So how do you stand out?
They're impatient.
Yeah.
And I don't blame, because you're getting an opportunity. The technology has given an opportunity today. You're talking about Cannes. I just came back from there, and this was an advertising festival where I received an award. Now, if you see what Indians are doing, if you see the use of technology there, there are two kinds of technology I saw in Cannes, and one is the kind of indulgent kind of technology, which is like empowering already empowered. So you give robotics to someone who could use an iPad, or in finer into it and more indulgent in that sense. What we've seen in India, what we received also for, is that the young people are trying to use human tech, social tech. They're trying to reach the technologically dark, absolutely, and trying to empower, change rural life completely. I mean, if something has to be awarded today in the advertising, it should be UPI on a branding case, or a case which or technology case which has transformed life. Now, for someone who really enjoys technology and is indulgent, would probably find UPI basic. It's an empowerment digital payment method. But someone who really feels that technology should change and transform lives would see that as a huge leap of humanity into future. So I think India, you're seeing those things. And India is seeing people really wanting to tell these stories you haven't heard before. The lens you saw India from, and yes, one is the kind of stories which Amish, beautifully tells. There is another kind of story which is like human endeavor, stories of human endeavor in India. Despite being economically where it used to be, there is an India which functions beautifully inside. And how does it function? How has it been? I have a serious objection to the word jugaad. A lot of people use that. I find it condescending. I find it not complimenting our people. Any other country would have called it innovation.
Yeah.
And I think that attitudinal shift, that value the innovation of your own people. I think that's happening in storytelling also. We're respecting our stories. I mean, I was very happy when Nawaz Bhai was talking about Vivek, funding or financially helping or promoting of it. You need really believers. We have a lot of franchises when it comes to the films, or in television programming. You see a lot of international franchises which have been, some of the very popular programs in television are actually franchises which have been taken from somewhere else. Now, we have great ideas, just that we today require believers in those ideas. We need really people, and he's right when he says, Sanjeev, we often talk about it, is that if you're financially not there, your ideas will have idea infanticide. And there are too many idea infanticides in India.
It's almost like a design this, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about on our next panel. I'm being told off because the time is up, but thank you so much. Nice to talk to you. I know.
That's your
We could
fault.
go all day. We could, if you all want to skip lunch, we can carry on.
If only we knew someone who actually control things and increase the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together.
Thank you.
very much.